Hey everybody, I'm Reza Shadmehr. Immigrant to America. Came here when I was 14 years old, and fortunately they let me stay. And I was interested in understanding movements. Why is it that we are so much better than machines, and yet using the same mathematics that are used in control of machines to try to understand how we move? So it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I hope that I can be a little bit of help. I know that really Xaq and Shreya have done all the work, so I'm just happy to try to be of some use.
Reza, you're very humble as usual, and it's been an absolutely enormous team doing stuff. So, thank you for all of the people involved in Neuromatch. There are other people behind the scenes even now who are running the show, and so you can see Tara is sending us messages and making sure things are working out okay. And so, yeah, thanks everybody else behind the scenes. So we already have a number of questions that people have upvoted. And so we can start right away by starting to take those questions. And we should be live on YouTube streaming as well for those of you following on that venue. Hello. So the first question from Belkis is, can optimal control theory be applied or extended to explain complex sequences of behavior that might require long-term memory? So would Shreya or Reza, would you care to tackle that one?
I can take a brief tackle on this. Yeah, in optimal foraging, which is a form of simplified form of optimal control theory, your background rate of reward, your history, is the most important variable because it determines your decision making and the way you move. And this is the idea that if you're depressed, which is your history is low reward rate, I don't have to ask you, are you depressed? I can see it. I can see how you move. And the way you move is an expression of your reward history. That mathematics is expressed in the capture rate, the global capture rate, which becomes an element that describes how you make decisions based on your past history and how you move based on that.
Shreya, you want to amplify that or provide a different perspective?
I think Reza basically explained it all. I think so. The complex sequences of behavior, while it might be more complicated to address using optimal control theory, it's definitely possible. And I think it would really depend on the application, I suppose, the specifics of the application, but it's maybe misleading to think that it's only acting on a very short time horizon. Of course, all these things are acting in a very much longer time horizon than what we've seen today. So I think, yeah, maybe that's an attempt. Xaq, you should also take a crack.
Yeah, I think one of the key questions about control here is, what is a state that you are acting based upon, and what are the actions that you're allowed to take? So in the case of memory, you can fold an entire history into the present state, and then your memory contains what you need at the moment. And so then what you've done in the recent past actually goes into your state as well, and thereby can change how you map from that state to an action. And that will give you the ability to represent longer sequences because you're actually using that more complicated state. That's something that you can see in foraging, where as you take actions, it changes your prediction of how likely something is to be available, and allows you to decide based on even just your actions, not even necessarily any reward feedback from the world, but changing your prediction to make a sequence. So I think that, yes, you can definitely take sequences and optimize that, but it's kind of indirect through this representation. Then there might be another framework of thinking about it where you directly create a sequence by some kind of continuous attractor or some dynamical system. But still, you can consider that just following physics of the world, that physics is evolving in your brain in a Markovian way. And so you just need the state now, and it will produce the next update. So do you think that that's consistent with the perspective that you and the two of you were offering?
Yeah, I think the thing you said about memory is exactly spot on. I mean, really, the state can be expanded to include as many things as you want, and including as much memory or as much history of the task and the action that you want. So I think that that's very important to note. And today we saw mainly 1D examples, but this is exactly where multiple dimensions in the state will help you. You can define that state to be exactly the other dimensions of the state to be that history. So yeah.
Cool. So then the next question that we can take is from Svikruth. It begins saying, humans are weird. And okay, yes, absolutely. While animals tend to behave in ways that might optimize fitness or value functions that might be detrimental or advantageous, we still do it for happiness. Like she gives the example of base jumping as an example. And so base jumping is something which is very risky. Is all of life an optimization? And what would we expect for non-optimal behavior from an organism with a brain?
Yeah, I love this question. If you use mathematics, it gives you a framework to view behavior. So it might give you a rationale to understand why impatience takes place when the background reward rate is low, or when the way you are making movements is expressing joy. Why is it that you have a spring in your step after a wonderful experience? So these formalisms provide one way to pay attention to these interesting things. But at the same time, as you say, there are behaviors that we do that seem suboptimal. We give some examples of this. I talk about how when ecologists look at the way crows dig up clams on the beaches of Pacific Northwest, they see that they throw away food when it's too small. The clams that they've already spent time digging, they throw them away. And then, this leads to formalisms that say, well, actually these equations to some extent aren't really explaining everything. And on the other hand, we have neuroscientists who say, well, what do you mean by these equations? Because the brain uses neurotransmitters to describe how we value things. And when we think about reward, when we think about effort, these are neural states in our brain. And then that becomes subjective value. So if you're talking about energy, if you're talking about, things that are externally measured and objective, that has to be mapped on to subjective things in the brain. And that transformation is what economists on one hand have worried about for centuries. These functions that say dollars that have objective value get transformed to subjective things that are depending on the person, how rich you are, how poor you are. Neuroscientists use that same concept, but go from objective things to neural things, which is dopamine to serotonin. And those depend on your brain. And so then there are these distortions that we introduced in these functions, but all about trying to understand, how we make decisions and how we move.
Yeah, I think piggybacking on that, optimal control theory is really just a theory, right? It's a framework that is very useful to understand some actions that we may be taking, and it can be very useful if applied correctly. But I don't think it's claiming to really solve or understand everything, including, as Reza was mentioning, the subjective aspects. Sometimes they're harder to model. They're sometimes more difficult to model. But I think the idea is that we are trying to model these phenomena, and optimal control theory provides a lens in which we can look at these, from which we can look at these, and hopefully it's a useful lens. That's all we're really offering. And that's all we're aiming for.
I think there are a couple of ingredients that are good to incorporate into optimal control. And I think, Reza, you're talking about neural constraints and motivations. I think that these are two really important things that it becomes really hard to formalize what the problem is that you're trying to solve with optimal control. So how do you specify what a motivation is? And how do you know what a constraint is? Like the brain can only do these things. Your body is only able to move these ways. And so intrinsically, you have to solve a problem within some constraints, and the constraints define that problem. Yeah, exactly. Defining the problem is really hard. One thing that we've done in collaboration with Zhongwei Wu, who I hope will join us today, and also Paul Schrader, who's one of the organizers, and Minhei Kwan, who joined us last night, and Saurabh Daptar, while I'm putting out their names, is to think about, to flip the question, to say, under what assumptions would your actions be optimal? And so then you can say, well, what does it look like you're solving? And we call that inverse rational control. So then every behavior becomes rationalized in that way. And it might not be very parsimonious. It might be more complicated than just saying animals are doing a bad job, or humans are doing a bad job, or we're motivated by something else. But when you incorporate constraints like learnability, how, and novelty detection and things like that, that can span a greater range of tasks than something that seems perplexing from the point of view of local small scale optimal control, can be viewed in a broader scale, like, oh, it makes sense that you're doing this because your goal is not to solve my experiment, but to do well in nature. And so then it's a different optimization problem that emerges in this context. It's tough though. It's a tough one to solve, but at least philosophically, I like that perspective. Let's see. Phoebe asks, are there any real life research scenarios that are open loop? Can I say most scenarios are closed loop because organisms have memories? Interesting question.
I'll give you a real life example that I give to my students. I don't know if you are familiar with the high jump in Olympics. High jumps is a task where a person runs and then they try to cross a bar. And there was a fundamental change in the way humans did that task because of an engineering student. He was an engineering student at the University of Oregon, and his name was Fosbury. And what Fosbury did is that he changed the way humans jump over bars. Instead of jumping so that you cross the bar with your belly under you, he jumped it with his back under him. And that made it so that the center of gravity as he was crossing the bar was below the bar. And that made him able to jump higher. Now, the real reason why that was made possible was because they changed the padding that they would have on the other side of the bar. So that it used to be you would just jump and then you would fall on grass or normal kind of stuff on the ground. But they added these huge pads. So now it was possible for him to jump and land on his neck on the pads. So the risk associated with the jump fundamentally changed. You didn't have to break your neck anymore. And he came up with this new way of jumping. So, I think there are absolutely some real world things. I sort of imagine that if there was really fantastic models of the human body, it would show you the optimal way to do anything. But we don't quite have those yet. So maybe the computers would tell us how to form these jumps. So I think there are some real world applications.
I mean, to also provide a simple one, if you don't get feedback of your action, that can be an example of open loop. So if you really, let's say you're trying to reach for something and you close your eyes and you don't have you're not feeling anything on the way, that can be considered an open loop scenario where you have planned your movement in advance and you're just carrying it out. would Reza and Xaq agree with that simple example?
You know, I don't, Shreya, I don't know if there are any biological movements that have no feedback, that are open loop. Even a saccade that is, you know, 50 milliseconds in duration, even that movement is under a control of a forward model, something that is predicting how things are going as you're producing it.
Right. So there are these loops in the brain itself, yes.
Yeah.
And you also get proprioceptive feedback. So I'm kind of ignoring that part of it. But if you take the brain as a whole and consider that as the entire thing as one big controller, then you can kind of approximate it as an open loop.
One of the examples that a panelist last night, I believe it was JJ Orban, suggested was that feedback delays mean that you're always operating to some degree in open loop mode because you don't get an immediate feedback. So maybe for slow things, you can handle always having feedback, but for something quick that you have to react to, you have to make a prediction.
And an interesting example for me is saccades and how, you know, you make a lifetime of saccades. Every day you make hundreds of thousands of saccades, and yet you never can do it well with just an open loop system, because if you damage your cerebellum, you will have deficits in your saccade, even though you've been doing it for all your life. The colliculus can generate a saccade, but it can't do it without this internal monitor that appears to make predictions about how things are, you know, moving along. And it's like that forward model. Without a state estimator, there can't be a control policy.
There are a couple of questions about tutorial 2 that I think, Shreya, I would point to you. We have a question from Manolo and a question from Federica. Federica asks, what's the relationship between rho and the goal? And what is rho? That was the weighting function on the action cost. And Manolo asks, in the time varying goal, LQR, we substituted the action cost, which was just a sum over squared actions, by the sum over the actions minus at a bar, some target action squared. And so that's actually a little bit different than what's written there in the question, but I think that the same question holds there. And they seem to be two different concepts. The first one is about just minimizing total energy, and the second one is about minimizing some other kind of planning error. How would you relate these two, and doesn't optimal action require both of those in some way, and how do you consider that?
Yeah, so it is sum of a minus a bar whole squared, and that. So basically, the idea is that we do not want to we want to consider the action minus the desired action. Basically, we don't want to have a term in there that so the A bar is the desired action to get to the goal based on the reference trajectory. So here the goal being G of T. And we don't want to penalize the controller for having the desired action be very large. We just want to penalize it for that difference of the action and the desired action.
You say want to, right, Shreya? Like this is a modeling choice? Would you say
it's basically a modeling choice if you're right, exactly. So if your desired action is also, it also needs to be penalized, then yes, one can just basically penalize A of T. It basically is a modeling choice, and you'll get a different response than the one that's mentioned if you just penalize A of T. Here, we decided to not penalize the desired action. And that's the more sort of, that's the more common way that you see this in textbooks as well.
So you might say, for example, you have a desired action or an easy action. that's not necessarily zero, and that you're just following kind of the default trajectory there, and what you penalize is deviations from the easy trajectory. But then what makes something an easy trajectory? I think that becomes the modeling. What is a bar? How do you choose a bar? Maybe a bar is open loop control. Maybe a bar is something else. And do you need to know something about the system that you're modeling in order to define the a bar?
Yeah, definitely. It depends on the system itself and on the goal. So it really takes into account that goal trajectory. And then A kind of acts on the deviations between what that desired or trajectory based on entirely just the goal and what you actually, so A takes into account the state itself, the state itself, and a bar really depends more on the goal. That's the idea. So yeah, you can look at it as an open loop controller versus correcting what that open loop controller does using A.
Great, thanks. I hope that answers the question of those participants. It looks like, Reza, you are in the process of answering an interesting question from Reza online. Do you want to go ahead and read the question and answer it?
Oh, would you mind reading it for me?
Sure, yeah.
I don't know it.
Okay, because it says Reza Shadmehr is going to answer this question live, and okay. I didn't click that button, but maybe I did by accident, I don't know. The question is, in optimal control and generally in normative models, we talk about how the brain should and should not do these different things. And we can design systems with optimal mathematics, but so far they can't do as well as the brain. So what are we missing? What is this special thing about the brain that makes it different from other systems? It's a great question.
It's such a deep question. I think that I don't have a good answer for you. I can just come out and say it from the beginning, because if I knew what was wrong with the equations, then I would try to solve them, of course. I think that what the best thing we can hope is that the mathematics highlights things in our experiments, in our daily lives, that we should pay attention to, because they say these are the things that would matter to a machine that wanted to do this task. And I don't know if that makes sense to you. So basically, I've often thought that if you want to know how something moves, you should know something about how to make something that moves. So you should know something about how to make robots move, because if you understood a little bit about the engineering problem, maybe it would help you understand the biological problem. But of course, it's not enough. It's not enough to know that, right? But I think it does provide us with some windows that are associated with the person that attempts to do the same thing with a physical system. It's like playing God in a way. If you attempted to build it, maybe it'll help you understand how it was built.
So this is also a question that can connect to tomorrow's content, because tomorrow the subject is reinforcement learning. And so there you can ask, well, optimal control is how do you control a problem when you completely know it, whatever the domain of the problem is. And reinforcement learning you can view as, how do you get to knowing it? How do you learn the dynamics of the system and the policy that you should take so that you can actually implement the control? And so maybe that learning process for us is really effective, and that the control is maybe not as hard, or it could be that the control is hard and the representation is already good from lots of other experience. But one of the things that people seem to describe is that active learning is really important. So you learn best when you do things and try them out. You like, turn this knob, oh, that actually does something, as opposed to passively watching things change in the world. And so there may be a real important connection here between how we explore the world and how we come up with better representations of it that we could use for control. Okay, let's see.
I also went ahead and answered Frederica's question in the text.
Go for it.
Yeah, so that's there in case anyone wants to take a look.
Sorry, say again, Shreya? I didn't quite hear you.
Oh, I typed the answer to one of the questions on the row, on the relationship of rows.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you.
Material too.
So Alex asks, when considering optimal control as a why model for how the brain works, like for a motor task, is it fair to assume that reliance on closed loop feedback is reduced after extensive practice because our internal model or prior of the system becomes more accurate? And are we therefore able to anticipate better how a given action will affect the system, meaning we don't have to wait for sensory feedback to know which action to take? Shreya, you want to take this one?
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it, actually. So if you're practicing, for example, tennis, right? That's one of the most common examples one uses in motor control. But if you're practicing a tennis serve, in the beginning, you will actually use the feedback of how the ball reacts, and at any given time, how the racket is functioning. But as you practice more and more, your internal model of how that racket and the ball is going to react given your movements, that becomes better and better. So that internal model is actually, as Alex mentions, it becomes more and more accurate. So I think that's a great way to look at it. You don't need as much of the sensory feedback, what your eyes are telling you, and what you're feeling. You don't need as much of that, but that only applies to certain kinds of movements. If the actual goal itself has its own dynamics that you cannot model, perhaps because it's not a tennis ball anymore. And I'm trying to think of a good example, but let's say it's something that actually has its own dynamics that you cannot model. A yo-yo, which is hard to model, let's say. Then you really need that feedback. So I think in the case where it is possible to model the dynamics of the thing that you're trying to control, then yes, I think your intuition is good. Reza, do you have something to add to that?
I've been thinking about it as you were answering it, Shreya, and it really highlights our ignorance associated with the effect of time and memories and how they consolidate. But we know that value functions that are associated with states that have been learned a long time ago appear to be stored different parts of the basal ganglia than the ones that have been recently learned. And so whether they influence the policy in a different way than before, whether the memories that have been acquired make it so that the states are evaluated differently, maybe they become harder, maybe those value functions become harder to change. Certainly this is some of the concepts behind the notions of habits, which are these things that become resistant to evidence. So you just saw that it didn't work, but you seem to ignore it. So yeah, these are things that are obviously not so much thought about when we write these simple equations, right? But I think there are links to it, to neurobiology, in terms of consolidation of value functions and potentially different parts of the cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia.
I would also mention that there are predictable and unpredictable parts of dynamics. And so I think what we're talking about is failing to predict the predictable part. So you could, in principle, you should be able to predict that. But there's always some other part that you cannot predict. And there is no way to avoid using feedback control for that, because there's no prediction you can make by definition.
For example, in high wind situations, or when you're playing tennis in a tornado.
Yeah.
You really can't predict what the ball is going to do. Or
Somebody has proposed, somebody has proposed Quidditch as an interesting example. The snitch in Harry Potter, you have to catch the snitch, and it's always moving around.
It has its own dynamics. Yes, perfect.
Yeah, it's got some process noise there. There was a request for me to give an example, which is audience participation, which is funny when we have an audience that we can't see, but about doing predictions. So I think, Reza, I've showed you this example before when you visited, but I'll give it to the audience now upon request. So probably most of you drive. If you don't drive, you might ride a bike. And so I want to invite you to participate in this little demo where you're going to change lanes. Imagine that you are driving down the highway and you're in the right lane. You want to get to the left lane. So hold the steering wheel. You remember this one, Reza? And hold the steering wheel and then make the movements of the steering wheel to switch lanes. Okay. And you have to close your eyes and imagine doing it. Okay. So Shreya, you're the only one I get to observe doing this. So I'll watch you.
I'm with you.
Okay. Ready? Close your eyes and then steer.
Sorry, where am I shifting to? Left or right?
You're from the right lane and you want to go to the left lane.
Okay.
Ready, go.
Sorry, I'm moving my whole body for some reason.
Yeah, just steer the steering wheel. Okay. So you done?
Yeah, I'm in the left lane now.
Okay, you're dead.
Unfortunately, good to
know. Here's why you died, because you turned this way, which rotates the car, and then you straightened out. But Reza is now in predictable visual mode and unpredictable auditory mode. We seem to have lost your video, Reza. You might have to log out and log back in. I'm not sure, or just wait for the internet to catch up. So Shreya, you turned like this, which rotates the car, and as long as your wheel is turned, the car will rotate. Then you straighten out. Welcome back, Reza. And when you straighten out, now you just go in that direction. So what that means is, from the overhead view, your car turned and now you straightened out and you went this way. What we don't—
Oh, you're right.
What we don't realize is that changing lanes requires an S turn. You make a left to get out of the lane and a right to get parallel back into the lane. And the question is, why don't we know that, given that so many of us drive all the time? And one very natural reason is that we rely on closed loop control. We rely on measurements. And so you only reveal your internal model when you take away those measurements, when you take away your sensory data. And so this is something that in control experiments, we need to do to actually reveal an internal model and show what the predictions are. We force the participant in the experiment to make a prediction. Right, someone who's been driving blind for a while must know this. I mean, there's a lot of people who do that, right?
Beautiful example.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Beautiful example, Xaq.
It's not my example. I think I learned of it from Paul Schrader.
That's wonderful. I have to congratulate him on that.
That's a really good example. I don't know if he came up with it or not.
I want to see a class full of people doing that.
It's hilarious. I've done this multiple times, and I've seen 2 people that get it right. Just 2 out of literally hundreds. Okay, so here's another LQG question. In today's tutorial about LQG, we saw that process noise is more influential on the cost function compared to measurement noise, but process noise is more influential on the state cost compared to the cost of control. Why is that? Shreya, you want to tackle this one?
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, to be honest, but I'll just say that process noise is more influential on the error that one gets between when trying to drive the state towards a goal. And that's exactly what we saw in the last part of tutorial 2. And really part of the reason there is that the unmodeled dynamics. So really you can think of the process noise as something as the unmodeled dynamics. So the rest of the actual model dynamics go in the equation D, which is modeling the state dynamics. But process noise is if you're trying to approximate, let's say, a nonlinear dynamics, you put that you put the unmodeled part, the non I guess the non-linear part into this other term, right? So it's everything that you cannot model, either because of environmental um, uh, variation or because you just don't know how to model it. So that really ends up hurting you. So if you have a perfect model for your dynamics, that's when your process noise will be zero, and that's exactly when, even if you do have some measurement noise, that's not going to affect your ability to get to the goal as much. So this is exactly what we saw in the last part of the tutorial, that it really, that when you leave some dynamics unmodeled, it really hurts you, or can hurt you to a large extent. I'm not sure if I really answered the question of why it is more influential.
There's also a question about units, right? Like, what are the units of observations versus the units of state cost? And if they are in, like, because they are different quantities. And so which one, like a single time step noise, does it have equal, like how do you directly compare them to say that one is actually bigger than the other or more influential than the other? Because if you turn up the observation noise, then you end up with a different, a different balance. So how do you equate them? I'd have to think about that. I don't know the answer.
So really, we are always, we're always looking at the difference between the state and the goal as our error. So that's why they are actually, well, comparable, because and that's how we compared them, because even if you have some measurement noise, your state estimation can still be can still take care of that, and as long as the dynamics are well modeled, you can still get to the goal fairly accurately. And that's kind of what we saw in tutorial 2, but that's how we're comparing them. It's true that, of course, if your measurement noise is much higher, then you will get to that same kind of error as a lowish process noise. But we're comparing this, we're comparing apples to apples here. We're comparing really that error between the state and the goal. That's the way I see it.
Here's a fun question. Is optimal control theory applicable only at the macro level, or can you also use the same ideas to predict model plasticity and memory? And we could even generalize that question further, like what, in the beginning I mentioned, what are the actions? We can think about this in many different contexts. Like, can you use that to control, to modulate, like cognitive control? Or can you regulate different parts of your brain in a control way? Like, what is the domain of control that you can think of this as being fruitfully applied to? Or even external loops, right? Like brain-computer interface. Like, what is the, is there anything which cannot be viewed as control when you have some action?
As soon as you have loops and this kind of an idea of an agent, I think you can really look at it as a controls problem. So that's my 2 cents there. I think Reza is still thinking about.
So I think there is a large chasm between the way neuroscience and control theory thinks about cost functions and the way biologists think about it. And so at the level of biology, what matters is the gene and how many times did it get to copy itself. So it couldn't care less about the macro scale unless it affects its survival, unless it affects the ability of that segment of your DNA to replicate itself. And that's the concept of, the selfish gene. And I am struck by this huge chasm between the individual, which is the subject of our equations, and the gene, which is the subject of biology. You
can imagine also the idea of like neural Darwinism as well, that individual neurons are trying to optimize their own relevance or survival, and even down to synaptic plasticity. So those could have their own little local controllers, and you could have broader controllers that govern the whole organism. And you can even have, imagine there are species level controllers or ecological level controllers that maintain the health of an ecosystem based on some state of the ecosystem and some action that it's able to take. Maybe at some point those start to break down. But again, it depends on what you allow as the space of actions. What is an action for a gene?
Yeah, yeah. The only thing that matters from that perspective of the gene is that, did you get to replicate yourself? And your life you're just a vessel for carrying this unit of biology, and the gene will live on forever. Well, we will be born and die. In some sense, it is a contrast between physics as represented by equations of motions of Newton and subatomic particles.
The particles are the constituents, and you can still define the actions of composite things. Yeah, it's about coarse graining, I think. I mean, here this gets back to the Markovian question as well, because we know that physics itself at the subatomic level or the quantum level is Markovian. You have the Dirac equation or the Schrodinger equation, which dictates that you update the state based on the next evolution. But if you coarse grain and you consider an object, that object has all these hidden states inside of it, which might change the behavior, right? So you take like a hard-boiled egg and you spin it, and it just spins. You take and you stop it, it stops. You take a raw egg, you spin it, and you stop it, you let go, it spins again, because the inside of the egg is still rotating. And so when you consider the object, like a collection of genes or a collection of particles or a collection of creatures or neurons, it has a latent state that, if you correctly account for the latent state in terms of how it affects the dynamics, then it will be governed by Markov equations. But if you don't, then you have this history dependence, which might look perplexing and would require, let's say, a brain who's interpreting it to develop their own latent state that would capture this hidden dependence. And this is connecting to the hidden Markov models that the brain would then have to make about the world or each other. I mean, we make latent inferences about each other all the time. You know, like you see a smile or a wink, and like, what does that mean? There's a whole big complicated process behind that skull. And we have to make models of that in order to act appropriately.
Interpret it.
I like these questions. This is really fun.
Getting very philosophical.
Yeah, we're getting very philosophical here. Let's see. So here, Debanjan has a very general question for us. All of these types of modeling that we've been doing this week to explain the underlying phenomena, do we think that the models and states we come up with point to the only solution to the problem? In other words, is the solution unique, or are there an abundance of ways to describe things that are equivalent? If so, how do you distinguish between them?
Yeah, you know, the fundamental problem with optimality is that when something doesn't agree with it, we change our equation. So it risks being unfalsifiable. But to be honest with you, that also is the basis of science, right? So we just are trying our best. We think this is the best that we can do. We gather evidence, and then we try to see, does it match this? But if from the onset, the framework does not provide a unique solution, then I think we're kind of in trouble, right? Because we don't have a very sharp tool with which to analyze the results and say this matches it, this doesn't. At least at the onset, we should have theories that provide us with concrete predictions rather than a valley of predictions.
So I actually have a different view on that. And I'm very interested in thinking, like in neural networks, this shows up all the time. You have a neural network that tries to map some input to an output, and there's a huge family of degenerate solutions. And if you want to go down to the mechanism, you can say, well, there's nothing that distinguishes them. But if what you care about is the solution itself, now you can define an equivalence class of solutions. All of these would be equally good if it's that neuron active or this neuron that's active, or both of them are half active. Those are all equally valid solutions. And so what we may want to do is develop a language that describes the class of solutions and collapses anything which is equivalent down to the same solution. And that can still make predictions not within the equivalence class, but between different equivalence classes. And so there you may not have a unique solution, but the part that's not unique may not matter.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The neural net example is a good one as well. Yeah, you definitely have degenerate solutions in these kinds of problems, and that's not in itself, I think, a bad thing, as long as you don't consider that degeneracy as, if you don't just pick one of the solutions as the correct one, but really consider the entire valley.
So this connects back to the material that we covered in Neuromatch in the first week on dimensionality reduction. You have a big space, and you have to find the right way of reducing the space to give you the relevant nugget of content there and ignore all the stuff that's equivalent. Doing that well is a real challenge. So we have some limited tools to do it, and we need to develop more tools and a better language that allows us to define these equivalent classes. I mean, you can see this in physics too, right? Like temperature. Temperature is a huge equivalence class of states of the system. And we don't care which state it is because they all have the same kinetic energy. And so physics has a language in those cases of defining these equivalence classes. In physics, that comes about because of randomness, right? You're able to use some notion of a lot of randomness. And, but the challenge with neuroscience and a lot of machine learning is that there's a lot of structure there that would be really challenging to incorporate in that physicsy way. So that's why I think we need a new kind of language, or like at least good tools for the right kind of targets for dimensionality reduction. And so I think that's an important topic. Maurice wants to join here. Hi, Maurice. Let me pull you in as an attendee. Sorry, as a panelist. Sorry, I didn't notice you there. We can let you have some final words. Okay, allow to talk. Here we go. Hi, Maurice.
Hey.
How long have you been hanging out?
Just a while, but I didn't have anything great to say for a little while, so I thought I'd just listen. But regarding the last question, I think it's really quite interesting what you and sort of contrast between what Xaq and Reza said, and so in a way, it's a kind of I'm in an engineering department. It's the classic contrast between an engineer and a scientist, right? So I think like this is obviously a little bit broad, but in general, engineers care about finding a solution or a good enough solution, right? And I think almost all the sort of engineers and designers will admit that there are many possible solutions out there, and rarely could you reasonably make the claim that you have the best possible solution, and that's okay. Of course, scientists and sort of like the ideal sort of scientific thing is that you want to find the truth, right? And not and this truth is sort of singular, like there is one truth, right? And so it's true that there might be an equivalence class of models that describes all we know, But I think like a true scientist would think that, well, if we knew more empirically, right, that would whittle that down. And eventually that whittling would come down to one truth. Now, maybe in some sort of metaphysical sense, there's more than one, but I think most scientists would think that there really is sort of one, and that the fact that we have models, there's a class of models that might describe everything, just means that, well, we don't have enough information to constrain them, right?
It's so good to have you, Maurice.
And so, thinking about, I think Zach's kind of way, so thinking about the equivalence class of models, in a way that's sort of like that's a sort of actually a great way to do science, right? Because that sort of tells you where we currently are, right? And then once you sort of have enumerated that class, or enumerated sort of makes it seem finite, or sort of define the class, even as sort of it's infinite in some way, right? That can sort of tell you, well, how is that we can go about advancing science by sort of reducing the size of the set.
So I think, sorry.
I was just going to say, so it may inform you which kind of measurements to take next, or what kind of constraints to consider next in order to really get at the one true solution. I think is that what you're getting at, Maurice?
Yeah. Another related point here is that there are different kinds of questions. And I mean, you pointed out engineering versus science, but even within science, there are why questions, there are what questions, and there are how questions. That's something that we actually talked about at the very beginning of Neuromatch Academy. And so you might have multiple possible mechanisms or how answers that accomplish a given why question. So this connects to David Marr's hierarchy. And so you can answer one of the questions without necessarily resolving the other. And so when you say, Maurice, that there's one true answer, you're saying, well, that's going to be one true answer that drills down all the way through all of the questions, from why, the functional question, what's the computational purpose, down to the mechanism that implements it. And yeah, that's an important thing for many people, especially if we're going to do things like intervene in brains. You don't want to know just the input-output map, but you want to know what can I change to help this person think better if you're doing cognitive interventions or repairs, things like that.
Right, and it could be that even at certainly in different species, that there are different solutions to a problem, and understanding sort of the kind of the solution set is important, because you might see different species sort of solve the same problem or very similar problems in very different ways. But it could be, I don't think we have incredibly good evidence of this to date, that even different individuals within a species, different people, right, might computationally solve challenging problems in different ways. I think that would be like really an interesting sort of avenue of work going forward.
Absolutely. Well, our hour is drawing to a close. I think we could go on like this for some time, fruitfully and with great fun. But we have to wrap things up so that people can go and have their meals and decompress from an intense day, and then ramp back up for some of them to do the projects. So I want to thank all three participants here on stage. Thank you, Shreya, for joining us and for your tutorials, and thank you, Reza, for joining us tonight, somewhere on Earth, and for your outro. And thank you for hopping in, Maurice, and for your introduction. I think all of these contributions have been really great for the day, and I hope that everybody in the audience has enjoyed that too. This conversation has been recorded, so you can go back and enjoy it again later, and learn ultimately to predict what we're going to say if you experience it enough times.
And thank you to the participants. Yeah, thank you to the participants for such excellent questions. I think they really sparked a great discussion. So yeah, this was great. Thanks, Zach, for organizing.
Thank you, Zach. And I just also want to thank the students. I think the reason why one becomes a professor is really because of the students. And I can see that the quality of the questions really reflect this joy that I hope that you have experienced in learning. And I've certainly, it's been a privilege to stand here for just a short while and listen to your thought process. And I've been very impressed. Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, I'd like to echo the same thing that Shreya and Reza just said. I mean, I think it's just incredibly high quality of sort of discussion here, really spurred by the questions that came.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And see you next time. Bye.
Bye.